If you are maniacally obsessed with the customer, meaning you do everything in your power within financial constraints, since I'm talking to a CFO here, to make the customer successful, you would have to catastrophically screw something up to not succeed as a business.
Cassie, wait, back up. Well, what was the NPS when you came in?
-26.
Okay, and wow, we have to unpack this.
The sub 100K contract value segment, right, was something like 13% of the total ARR of the business, but what's consuming almost 40% of the CSM team's time, which is insane. Your team will never be fully aligned if the compensation plan is not. Exactly. I mean, we all know the Charlie Munger line, right? Like, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. You cannot build enterprise value without customer value. And it's insane to me how often people forget that. And so when you put incentives aside, I'm like, if you want a really easy way to align the first team, align them around the customer. That's what matters.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Today on Run the Numbers, we've got someone who's seen the SaaS roller coaster from just about every seat. CRO, customer success exec, turnaround specialist, and now general partner at Primary Ventures. Cassie Young isn't just reinventing the next generation of growth leaders, she's helping shape them, armed with a Rolodex of lessons from probably 1,000 execs she's met along the way, and a spidey sense for spotting the 1% of execs who actually move the needle. Cassie's built and rebuilt go-to-market teams, fired customers on purpose, yes, we'll get into that, and she's got strong opinions on everything from NPS, overrated, to the metrics that really tell you if your customers are about to leave. And when she says churn is a lagging indicator, she really means it because she's lived through it. In this episode, we talk incentives, the myth of the perfect metric, and what AI means for customer retention today. Plus, some of her signature Cassie-isms, like why sunlight is the best disinfectant and how execs get stuck working in the business instead of on it. Whether you're an operator, an investor, or just trying to keep your SaaS metrics from going sideways, you'll want to hear this one. All this and much, much more after a short word from our sponsors. So if you listen to this podcast, you'll know that I am incredibly passionate about the FP&A space because that's the route I went to get to CFO. And I want to tell you about a tool that has exploded over the past few years. It's called Aleph. And I remember getting outbounded by them about 2.5 years ago, and I actually took the bait because they claimed to be able to do a demo with my live data, with me right there on the call. And so I had to see it to believe it. And it was the founder running demos back then. Shout out Albert, hope you're listening. And he connected my NetSuite and built my P&L using their Excel add-in in like 15 minutes. And I was really impressed. Since then, Aleph has gone on to raise money from some of the top VCs out there, and they've built an impressive roster of customers. Many of their customers have been on the podcast, like the CFO at Turo, 8 Sleep, and Zapier. They're all really big champions and supporters of Aleph like me. But it's not just an Excel add-in. Aleph also allows finance teams to work with their live cross-system data using Google Sheets and their web app. And that's cool because it gives teams the option to support a wide range of needs and workflows like budgeting, forecasting, and variance analysis. And speaking of variance analysis, they're doing some really cool things with AI-powered variance analysis. It basically allows you to figure out what's going on and why, and it takes the time that you'd usually spend from hours to minutes. It's really cool. And so I highly recommend checking them out and taking them up on that demo or trial, just like I did back in the day. And you can learn more and get started at getaleph.com/run. That is getaleph.com. aleph.com/run. Tell them CJ sent you. A messy or missing cap table might not just slow you down, it could cost you your next fundraising round. VCs get flooded with pitches, and if your equity is confusing or missing, they'll move on fast. Fidelity Private Shares is an all-in-one equity management platform that helps you maintain a clean cap table, an organized data room, and a clear equity story. Schedule a demo at fidelityprivateshares.com. Mention Mostly Metrics and get 20% off. Are you running a small or mid-sized business? Then you need more than spreadsheets or basic tools. You need Sage Intacct, the all-in-one cloud platform for accounting, ERP, and financial management. It's built for businesses like yours across industries like retail, financial services, logistics, tech, professional services, and more. Sage Intacct outperforms QuickBooks, beats NetSuite on flexibility, and delivers fast ROI, up to 250% with payback in under 6 months. Rated #1 in customer satisfaction for 8 straight years. That's not luck, folks. It's Sage Intacct. Check out the Sage Intacct financial management platform using the link in the show notes below and take control of your growth. Cassie, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. As I told you, I've been a long-time listener, and I'm thrilled to be here today.
This is so exciting. So were you just telling me you've been with the Pavilion crew and like a bazillion CROs and CMOs for the last 48 hours?
That's right. I was telling you that I arrived back last night from DC from Pavilion's annual go-to-market summit, and it was awesome. I had a wonderful time. I did the women's summit. I did the whole ordeal. I did say to my husband upon my arrival back last night, though, that when you get about 1,000 senior go-to-market people in one hotel, no one shuts up. So I needed a little bit of alone time last night to reflect and bounce back. I wouldn't trade anything for it, but I'm happy to be here talking to you, and then I don't want to talk to anyone else for the rest of the weekend. I'm deeply an introvert.
We're a big fan of Sam Jacobs, friend
Likewise.
of the pod, and what he's built. And I joke with my wife, I'll come home from just having one CFO dinner. I'm talking 3 hours, Cassie. And she's like, "You're being quiet. Is something wrong?" I'm like, "I've used all of my word quota for the next 3 days here."
I completely understand. Someone told me a long time ago, introverts are misunderstood, where everyone thinks, you can't be an introvert if you're not shy. I'm not shy, but I think the description was introverts just need a moment to recharge their batteries. And I had no time to recharge my batteries over the last couple of days. But Sam's awesome. And he does such a great job at that event. So as I said, I'm thrilled I made the trip, and also eager for just a little bit of downtime.
I want to kick things off by talking about what the composition and characteristics are of a great executive. And you're a really accomplished CRO, you're an accomplished C-suite member, and now you're on the other side of the table where you're interacting with and also helping companies to find their next sales leader. You've probably met with how many do you think? Over 1,000 in the last few years?
I used to say hundreds, and then I thought about this recently. I'm like, I've been at Primary 5.5 years, and I meet executives all day, all week long for the portfolio companies for Beyond. I'm like, I think it's well over 1,000 at this point. I'm actually pretty confident claiming the 4 digits on this.
So that's wild to me because not everybody makes it to the C-suite. So just to have that many reps at vetting people like that, I'm curious, what percentage of those people do you think were truly exceptional?
Absolutely. So, and maybe, when I say 1,000, that's probably a rounding to C-suite or VP level. So let's call it
Okay.
people who've been on an executive team, just to be a little bit broader with that statement. So yeah, I think I probably have gone on record in a bad way to say that when I reflect on all of those conversations, at least 90% of them are totally unremarkable and forgettable, is what I tell people. And for better or for worse, when a lot of times I'm interviewing people for roles, if nothing else, I'm doing general networking. I probably know within the first 10 minutes of those conversations whether or not it's going to be memorable. Now, the problem sometimes, CJ, particularly within sales and marketing for that matter, is, I would say great marketers market themselves. So sometimes you can be very impressed with someone in a conversation, but there's actually no substance right beyond what's actually being said there. But in general, when you really unpack the experiences of these people, and we can talk more about that in a moment, I very much believe that north of 90% of people who are in these senior roles today are actually not game-changing executives for the companies that they sit in.
It's funny how you say CROs, CMOs, CXOs, they're pretty likable people. I mean, yeah, that's part of their job.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
I reflecting on it live here, I don't think I've ever met a CRO or interviewed a CRO where I was oh, that person wouldn't be a good hang, or I wouldn't enjoy working with them. But I have worked with a lot of them who didn't hit their number. So it's kind of maybe I'm the naive finance person where I'm won over easily, but I think I would have a harder time vetting it on the personality basis.
Oh, it's really hard on the personality side. So for me, when I get into these interviews or conversations, I try to get to the substance very quickly. What's interesting, though, is I think the exceptional executives don't wait for you to get to the substance. You know what I mean? They know how to engage you at the top of the conversation while also whetting your appetite, right, based on their experiences or some of just sort of the things that they lead with off the bat.
What separates the unforgettable ones from the top 1%?
Absolutely. So I have done a ton of reflecting on this, and I'll share that the reflecting is not just for my time at Primary over the last 5.5 years. Like while I was an operator, I worked with some amazing executives, and I worked with some people that I would prefer to forget, right? As we think back on that. And at the end of the day, I actually think it comes down to four things. And I talk about these as being the core four traits that I think really separate the best executives from everybody else. And so to tick through those, and we can go into any one of them in more detail. The first, and I hope this will be music to your ears as a former CFO, is the importance of P&L fluency, or understanding how the work connects to the top and bottom line. Now, that can sound a little hand wavy. So whenever I talk about the importance of this, I always love to actually tell the story of something a board member said to me many years ago when I was still on the operating side. So 2019, I was operating inside of an Insight portfolio company, and they ran this amazing event where they invited all of the C-suite women from Insight's global portfolio to New York for this amazing 2-day program where they talk to you about how to get on more boards and things along those lines. It sounded great and abstract, and it was a wonderful event, but there were not a ton of women there, number one, despite the size of their portfolio. And when they threw up the obligatory pie chart at the start of the session, they showed the functional areas represented, and perhaps unsurprisingly, there was a massive skew toward HR. Now, I am not hating on HR because I'm like, everything in life is a people problem. It is a really important business partner, but there was a real lack of go-to-market leadership, product and eng leadership, et cetera. Long story short, I'm at dinner that night. One of my board members is this amazing woman, Shelley Perry, serial technologist and leader. She was the CTO of HP SaaS once upon a time. And she said to me, Cassie, the number one reason more women won't be in this room is because, and the reason they don't make it from VP level to C-suite is because they can't walk their way through an income statement. And when she said that, I knew she meant it literally, meaning like it's baffling to me that you have people coming out of MBA programs who don't know if they're above the line or below the line in terms of where their function sits, right? But also figuratively in terms of they get so trapped working in their functional lane that they're not thinking about, the overall business results at large. She said that about women because we're at a women's event, but I actually think it applies way more broadly. And I'm sure you saw this, in your own time as a CFO with the executives who did or didn't know the P&L. So number one is P&L. I would tell you that Isabel Winkles, the CFO at Braze, said to me, I don't love that you're calling it the P&L fluency because it's really all the statements. And I'm like, yes, Isabel, fair. All the statements, you understand revenue versus cash, all that stuff. But P&L fluency has a nicer ring to it. So we'll roll with that. The second, I'll be briefer in these next three and we can kind of dig in, wherever most interesting. The second is related. And it's this importance of this concept of first team leadership that I wish I had invented, but I didn't. It's taken right from the playbook of Pat Lencioni, who wrote books like 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, or the idea that your first team is the most senior team you sit on, not your functional swim lane or your direct reports. And this sounds so obvious, yet so many executives actually, internalize it. Meaning, if you're the chief customer officer, you have a set of direct reports that includes the head of CSM, the head of implementation, the head of support. They are not your first team. Your first team is the senior executive team that you sit on. They are each other's first team. They are your second team. So said another way, right, when you're not embracing first team thinking, you fall victim to the swim lane trap where you're celebrating what's going on in your function, irrespective of what's going on in the business at large. We see it all the time, and I'll pick on marketing, right? Like we crushed it. Like most of the leads came from marketing this quarter, but the business didn't hit its plan, right? So it doesn't really matter. So that's 2. 3 is just having a pulse on the macro market, right? What's happening in the world and how does it impact your business? And in sitting here in the fall of 2025, AI is the trend, but this is just the news in general, right? What do tariffs mean for your buyer? Back when economic nexus became a thing, it was a huge ordeal for software companies and what it meant for their customers, right? And then the final thing is the importance of having a highly curated strategic network or a bat phone of people who call you back. And that same board member of mine, Shelley, who made the comment about the income statement, had another real zinger for me a couple of years later, where she said something along the lines of, in a search for an executive role where all else is equal between 2 candidates, the better network candidate will always get the job. Right. And they get the job because they have easier access to talent. They have easier access to customers, right? All of the above and everything in between. And so I think those are the 4 things when I'm interviewing executives that I'm looking for is how people really demonstrate strong command and successes across all 4.
That's amazing. I love that framework.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
This episode of Run the Numbers is brought to you by Mercury, business banking for founders and finance pros who want their financial stack to actually work together. Now, I don't plug tools I don't know or intimately use. I've been a Mercury customer for a couple of years now. In fact, I showed the Mercury dashboard to their CFO, Daniel Kang, from their finance team right before we hit record on this episode. It felt like a full circle moment. And what I love most is that Mercury isn't just banking, it's operational confidence. I can send a wire to a podcast editor, I can check capital balances, and I can approve a payment for a freelancer who helped me with a tech stack report, all without bouncing across tabs or praying a PDF exported correctly. Mercury's making a bet on builders. Whether you're issuing your first invoice or wiring 7 figures for a warehouse build-out, it's banking that scales with your ambition. Visit Mercury.com to apply online in minutes and see why over 200,000, entrepreneurs choose Mercury to run their business finances smarter. Here comes my banking voice. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided by Choice Financial Group, Column NA, Evolve Bank and Trust, members FDIC. The IO card is issued by Patriot Bank, members FDIC, pursuant to a license from MasterCard. All right, I got to get up on my soapbox for a sec here. Everybody's talking about AI-powered this and automated that. But here's the thing about revenue recognition. It's not just about moving data around. It's about getting it right, full stop. So RightRev is laser focused on one thing, RevRec that auditors actually trust. See, there's a difference between automating revenue processes and automating revenue recognition correctly. RightRev was actually built by the godfather of RevRec, who understands ASC 606 compliance, audit controls, data validation, and the flexibility needed for complex B2B contracts. We're not trying to be your billing system or your ERP. We're the revenue recognition engine that sits between your contracts and your financials, making sure every dollar is recognized correctly, on time, every time. Companies like Snowflake and Logic Monitor don't just need fast revenue reporting, they need revenue reporting that's audit ready from day one. And that's honestly where RightRev shines. And what I love about RightRev is they're not out there trying to be everything to everyone and just slap some, AI slop on top of it. While everyone is building these massive platforms that do everything in a kind of mediocre fashion, RightRev does one thing exceptionally well. They make sure your revenue recognition is bulletproof. Ready to stop gambling with your RevRec? Visit RightRev.com to see how we make complex revenue simple. That's RightRev.com, where revenue recognition actually works. Did you know that around 40% of manually processed invoices contain errors, missing data, bad codes, duplicates? And those mistakes don't just slow your finance team down, they cost you money. That's why global finance automation matters. It's not just about saving time, it's about keeping your business safe from costly errors. And that's exactly what Tipalti does. Tipalti is the serious AP solution for serious business. Tipalti automates the end-to-end payables process, handling everything from onboarding suppliers to global payouts, all so your finance team can breathe again. More than 5,000, of the world's most ambitious businesses already rely on Tipalti to make payments in over 200 countries and 120 currencies. With baked-in security and tax compliance, Tipalti gives you the confidence to scale globally without adding extra finance headcount. Give your finance team their time back. Don't let bad invoices drain good money. Visit Tipalti.com/run-the-numbers. Tipalti.com/run-the-numbers. Tipalti, serious AP for serious business. I'm going to come back to the P&L fluency as you probably could have guessed.
Yeah.
I do want to dig into the second one though.
Yeah.
So team first, I just want to make it more real. So I'm the head of finance, right? I have an FP&A director reporting to me. I have a controller reporting to me. I want to look out for my team, right? I also want to say, hey, we had a success story. We closed the books in 4 days. Can you make it more real for me? Like, should I be focusing on my relationship with the CTO before that?
Yeah, I think absolutely yes, right? Which is very unnatural for people. But at the end of the day, your first team is that team, right? Of the CTO, the CRO, et cetera, of the business. Don't mishear me. I mean, your functional metrics matter, right? Because they're inputs, right, into the business hitting its overall plan in terms of how you want to go do things, right? If your team improves DSO, right, that's a win for the whole business, right, on sort of the cash management side of what that looks like. But at the end of the day, I think what happens way too often is people are celebrating what's happening in their function, as I said before, irrespective of what's happening in the business at large. So what I always think about here is every business should have its first team metrics, right? Of, what are the things that everybody in the company knows are super, super important, so that when they're touting an individual metric, they maybe ask themselves the question of, does that really matter? Or am I optimizing towards some local maximum, right? So if I have, 95% CSAT on support ticket resolution, but your net retention is 91%, like, who really cares, right? But we're missing something there, and there's, a breadcrumb trail to get us from point A to point B. But going back to the relationship, CJ, I think, I always said you have to invest in building those one-to-one relationships with the other people around the table. And, one of my partners here at Primary, Rebecca Price, is a serial chief people officer. She's 10 times better at these team dynamics things than I am. But, to borrow a play out of her playbook, she always encourages executives to find the relationships that make them the most uncomfortable on the executive team and to go seek out more time, go on a walk with those people, try to build trust. And if you've read Five Dysfunctions, like the pyramid, the business results are at the top of the pyramid, right? They're the last thing that come after you have this trust, after you have this healthy conflict and everything else. And so I do think this is a place where it's really easy to get caught in the day-to-day of the team management and the numbers. But at the end of the day, like, all of those functions need to be rowing in the same direction and working toward the same goal to ultimately, drive business success.
A common example I've seen of it being disjointed and not being like the first team first is when like a CTO or a CPO is talking to board meeting about how fast we got a new product to market or how many bugs we fixed.
Yeah.
But then you look at like our gross retention, and it's like the worst it's been in like 6 quarters. It's like, oh, why are we talking about that? Are we not on the same page here?
Completely. And I love that example. And actually, we had this woman, Neetu Rajpal, speak at a Primary event a couple of months ago. She was the CTO of Oscar for some period of time. And she had this great line where she said, she used to regularly tell the product and eng folks in her organization, it does not matter if it cannot be sold, right? And it comes back to that point where so often it's exactly that. It's roadmap velocity, whatever it may be, but there's no corresponding data on customer adoption, right? Penetration, where that's going. And again, what you outlined is a prime example of what I call sort of the swim lane trap. So I regularly say, something along the lines of, marketing can't be crushing it if the business isn't crushing it. But I could say that about product. I could say that about finance, right? I could say that about any function, right? The two have to be working together. And at the end of the day, if the business doesn't hit its plan, no one's really a winner around the table.
Yeah. And I brought up Churn there. I had the pleasure of listening to a lot of other podcasts that you've been on, and you have this amazing story about a period of time that you went through at Sailthru. And one of the quotes that like hit me is that you said, churn is a lagging indicator.
Yeah.
And like, I knew that, but I'd never thought about it that way. How did that show up as a lagging indicator at Sailthru?
Yeah, absolutely. So I won't bore you with the intricate details of this, but let's just say when I got to Sailthru, the timing was, Series B of the business, growing amazingly quickly, and we hit some real technical scaling problems, right? And, to give you a sense of it, the core product that we were selling at that time was an email personalization solution, meaning we were sending emails on behalf of the Washington Post, Hallmark, right? Very big enterprise brands. Now, when you have issues and you can't deliver for your customers, the switching costs, particularly at that time, were really, really high, right? And so you could, meet for a weekly status meeting with the buyer, right, or whoever the stakeholder was, and you would know that they were annoyed, right, or that you failed to deliver in some way. But it could take that churn, upwards of a year to actually show up, right? And you might have a sense that it's coming, and we could talk more about customer health later. But I think it is absolutely a lagging indicator. And, I think when you and I chatted a couple of weeks ago, I probably mentioned something to you around like, I have this allergy to how people classically do customer health in a lot of board meetings, because you show up and it's like this red, yellow, green of how the CSM feels about the account. And I'm like, with all due respect to the CSMs, like, I don't really care how they think about it, right? There's ultimately, leading indicators of customer success. If anyone has been a part of an outage, right, or has these other attributes, in no way can that customer be green, even if they're, getting on the phone with you and shoot the shit for 20 minutes about the weather, right, or whatever it may be on that. So I do think it's a lagging indicator. And I think that, businesses have to do the real work, honestly, in partnership with their finance team to understand what the leading indicator metrics are for their particular business that would make a customer not only likely to renew, but likely to grow, right? And what are the levers of net retention for these companies?
like churn is the end result of something. It's the event that occurs, but
Yeah.
it's not like they woke up on that one morning and said, I'm going to check the other box. It's something led to that point, and it may have been even like 2 years prior if they're on a multi-year plan.
That's right. That's right. And I think it's like, listen, there's always the category of churn that we'll call death or marriage, right? And having sold into e-com and retail for a while, we had a lot of deaths where we did have some sudden churn, right? Of some of those D2C businesses of a certain era. Publishers weren't a great segment to sell into either. Marriages, they merge or they get acquired. But even that isn't always overnight, but you might see that happen. But to your point in general, I think there's lots of things that happen along the life cycle of the customer that indicate, are they going to be a great customer long term? And more importantly, are they extracting value, right? So one of the things I always say is you will never have enterprise value if you don't have customer value. For any business, if you are maniacally obsessed with the customer, meaning you do everything in your power within financial constraints, since I'm talking to a CFO here, to make the customer successful, you would have to catastrophically screw something up to not succeed as a business. But what's important is you have to look at the data to understand like what actually makes that the case. So I'll give you some examples, from my time at Sailthru. We actually did this exercise where we said, okay, let's analyze lots of different customer attributes and do the regression analysis of what makes for stickier customers, right? And we found some obvious things, right? Of, customers who use certain integrations were more likely to stick around. But then there were, some other interesting things like our product was admittedly harder to use at that time. We knew that you needed to have technical resourcing. You needed to have a command for it. And so there was a data point that emerged that customers who had attended a live training were more than 30% more likely to renew than those who had not. So if we had because these were all day trainings, right, in different cities. And so from there, we were able to, going back to taking the time to work back to the P&L, we could say something like, if we have an at-risk customer, would we fly them to the closest city? Do you know what I mean? And pay for the training if we know that statistically they're that much more likely to renew. But here's where things got really interesting. Where things got really interesting is when we actually asked customers for some of the inputs into that analysis. So to walk that back for a second, one of the things that we would ask in like the big NPS survey that we would send out 3 times a year, so Net Promoter Score survey, we would list out all of the product features that we had released since the last survey. We'd ask the customer 2 questions. Number 1, did you even know about this release, right? And number 2, did it actually have any meaningful impact on your business? Now, 50% of customers said they had no idea about these releases. I'm going to call BS on that because we were an email company, so we could track who read about the releases. And half the people who said they had no idea, like, they read the email. So it just goes back to, you got to hear something 7 times before it sticks. But long story short, the customers who knew about the product releases had net retention curves significantly higher than those who did not. But where things got very fascinating was there wasn't a statistically significant difference between whether or not it had any impact on your business. So it was this realization of perception being reality, where if the customer saw us innovating, it really paid dividends there. Now, you could say multicollinearity and all the stuff that kind of goes into the bit of them being aware of the product, but that was a major aha moment for us, the takeaway of which was we got to get a heck of a lot better with product marketing, right, to our own install base. And there were myriad examples of those types of learnings that came out that just got us better in terms of how we engaged and communicated with customers.
I'm such a dork, Cassie, when it comes to like these non-qualitative tells or signals around if a customer will be sticky. And I was at a backup and recovery firm.
I remember that. Yeah.
Veeam, and it was also an Insight portfolio company. And what we found was the retention was off the charts for any customer who had a like backup and recovery specialist on their engineering team who had been certified in Veeam. And what blew my mind is these people actually paid us. They gave us money to be certified. And it was like a huge point of like pride. Like they'd put it on their LinkedIn. They would put it on their resume.
So they're paying you, and then in exchange, these are stickier customers on the other side.
They're not going to leave because it becomes about them. It becomes like part of like what makes them great at their job.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I feel like there's so many examples of these like major aha moments for companies. Knowing you have a lot of CFO listeners on the line, some of my favorite ones are like price to value metrics and how you run that. So many years ago, I was on the board of another company that sold into e-commerce businesses, and we sort of backed into a price to value ratio. And the way we did that is we said, effectively, what's the ARR of this particular contract? And we had access to the Google site volume per year, the Google Analytics volume. And we learned that if that metric was slightly out of whack, the customer was literally guaranteed churn, right? So
Wow.
if something with the amount that they were paying you vis-a-vis the volume of people who were coming to their website was out of whack, guaranteed churn. So the way to operationalize the learning from that was actually a deal desk learning, right? Where we said, okay, when things are coming through, we now have enough historical data of dozens and dozens, if not 100 plus customers to say, let's right size this and make sure it passes the smell test. If we know, right, if that's so out of whack that even though they sign now, they're going to be no good for us, a year later. But I always think I'm a geek for these types of things too. I call them the sticky drivers of retention. I'm like, it's kind of like, solving a mystery when you're going about these things, right? They're kind of figure out what's true about the customers. But the more important thing is not the data analysis, it's the so what, right, of what you can go do and take back to the business and operationalize some of those learnings. But one thing I want to just emphasize as I'm talking about like all the fun data analysis stuff is at the end of the day, none of that matters if the customer is not extracting value. And so, my favorite framing of all, put aside any of the, the leading indicators, is what's it going to take for your customer to get promoted, right? Because if that's the language that you're speaking in, it makes doing everything else a heck of a lot easier. So I want to make sure when we get in the nuts and bolts of numbers, we don't, lose sight of the macro level thing that really matters most.
I've always said that like any product's real job is to make the user look better in the eyes of their boss. And maybe they are their own boss. So it's like to enhance their lifestyle or how much money they can take out of the business. But like at the end of the day, like even if it's an FP&A tool or an ERP, how do you make that person look like an all-star?
I totally agree with that. And we would go so far, we would advise the CSMs to say to their champion, when you have a performance review at the end of this year, what are they going to be looking at, right? Because that's also a very powerful way to keep their attention, or if they're on a bonus plan, right? What dictates your bonus plan, right? What are even if it's an MBO, right, that you're kind of thinking about, because then all of the language that you use has just supreme alignment with the customer.
How do you feel about NPS? And I always end up saying, by the way, NPS score, which I've realized is like saying net promoter score.
Yeah.
But just to put that aside, like
It's like when people say panini sandwiches.
yeah, or I remember there growing up, there was parent information night, and they called it pin night, but it was really parent information night, which was weird.
Yeah, gotcha. So how do I feel about NPS is the
Yeah.
centerpiece of the question. Yeah, so I think it has its time and its place, right? So at the end of the day, your reputation matters, right? And so a lot of people are very quick to dismiss NPS because they think it's a hard scale, and it is a hard scale. And I kind of like that about it, right? What I always say to people is you could survey 100 people with NPS, a scale of 0 to 10, and everybody gives you a 6, right? And your NPS with that is actually negative 100.
Sorry, just to back up on that then, just can you illuminate listeners, because NPS is the most bastardized metric. What's the correct way to do it?
Okay, so the correct way to do it is it's one question. People bastardize the definition of it all the time, but like, we did an NPS of like 9.2 on a scale of 1 to 10. So the way to do it is there's one question. On a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to refer this product to, a friend, family member, colleague, or depending on the discipline that you're building in? And what happens is the responses get grouped into different segments. So 9s and 10s are considered promoters.
Promoters, yeah.
7s and 8s are considered passives, meaning they're meaningless. They're not going to help you or detract from you. And the score, where people get upset about it, is anything from 0 to 6 is considered a net detractor of the brand. And the way you calculate NPS is you take all your 9s and 10s and you calculate the percent of responses that were 9s and 10s, and then you subtract the percent of responses that were 0s to 6s. So as a result, the score can range from negative 100 to positive 100, right? Now, to that example I just gave you, if everybody gives you a 6, that means 100% of your responses were a detractor. So if you heard the score 6 out of 10, it's worse than that. It's negative 100.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, it's negative 100, which is crazy, right? So people hate it because they're like, but 6 isn't bad. So why is my NPS like a negative 100? So that's why people don't like it. My counter to that is like, I hear you. So we can argue the merits and mechanics of the exact score. When I report on NPS, I like to put 2 numbers. I like to put the actual NPS score and the average response so that people understand. Were you a negative 100 with 1.0 average response, or were you negative 100 with 5.9 average response? I think that kind of grounds it. But at the end of the day, buyers talk to their friends. right?
Yeah.
And every brand competes on reputation. So put aside the NPS number. What you're really trying to solve for is the promoters that you ultimately have in the market. And so I do think there is tremendous value in the metric and that people talk. So if you compete on reputation, you need some way to measure it. But it's a harsh score. People say, look, if you have an NPS north of 50, that's actually really, really good. If you think about the brands that are actually in the, 85, 90 plus zone, it's like Harley Davidson is up there. Here's a fun one for you. USAA, the insurance company, I think has been on record of having like the highest NPS of any brand that's ever been tracked or something, along those lines.
Doesn't Comcast have like notoriously like one of the lowest?
Oh, for sure. I would say the airlines, any utility, lots of recurring charges tend to fall there. And I had the deep privilege during those scaling challenges that I mentioned earlier at Sailthru. We measured our NPS coming out of some of the dark days, and it was negative 26. So I told our board, I said, good news. Our buyers dislike us more than they hate Comcast, and they're paying us $200,000 a year. So we have to figure our way, out of that. And so that's a place where like, I care about what that signal is. But again, going back to the whole conversation you and I just had on sticky drivers, you have to do that same math with NPS because you can cut it so many different ways, right? And so NPS, why would someone not be a promoter? There are 1,000 different reasons why. They might hate your product, but they might hate your support team, right? Or, they may have a challenge underlying business. So just all that same regression that we talked about on net retention, you can have field day doing the same thing and cutting it for net promoter score as well. One really interesting thing there is to cut that data by stakeholder at the customer. So one way I used to do it when I was on the operating side is what is your economic buyer's NPS versus what is, the day-to-day user of the product's NPS, because that can be very enlightening, sort of see the difference between those two things.
Cassie, wait, back up. Well, what was the NPS when you came in?
Negative 26.
Okay. And wow, we have to unpack this.
Yeah.
Regardless of what metric we're using, I think you're getting the signal from that.
Yeah.
First, what did you do? What was the first step to go talk to customers? Because it sounds like it's a negative signal, but you probably want to figure out why.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things, first is, have a borderline coronary, right? Because that's a bad number, right? And we sensed it, right, from the conversations, but we had now hard evidence of this. So one of the first things we did is we actually did do a little bit of the data analysis that you and I talked about before. We tried to break it down by customer segment and things like that. Headline was it was pretty consistent across all, right? Because there were these technical challenges of what was there. But yeah, I mean, really what we did is we tried to translate that into exactly why people were upset. So going back to my point before, it could be a host of different reasons. At the end of the day, people weren't trusting us to get their emails out the door because of those scaling issues that I mentioned before. And so there were other things that they didn't like in the roadmap, right? Or they wanted feature X, Y, or Z. But we did go out, we did the tour with customers, we spoke with them. We would actually do an exercise where we would take all of the write-ins, all of the verbatim comments in the NPS score, bring our executive team in, order Chinese food, and sit for a night and go line by line through them just to kind of, understand them. And again, this was an enterprise business, so this wasn't like 1,500 responses. I mean, it was a couple hundred responses that we were talking about. But coming out of that, we said the number one thing that we could do for our customers is restore trust. So we really went on, I would say, a very open path with owning to them sort of where things had gone awry. And to give you a sense of it, like I said, we had technical scaling challenges. There's like 1,000 other things that happened in the midst of that, in the throes of it. Like there was hurricanes in New York, right, that took out one of our data centers. The next year we had something where we were forced to, Google was moving out of its building and we had to move our data center. And, hindsight's 2020, we didn't really hire anyone to help us with doing that, right? And we hit some problems. So there were lots of things, again, with the benefit of hindsight that we would have done differently. But we made it our marching order to focus on trust. And the way we had to do that was people talk about building in public. We built the trust roadmap in public with our customers around what we were going to be doing, what investments we were making. Like we did in that Series B have like an SRE team at the time, right, that was doing that. These were high volumes. And so we went on a journey to go and do that, but it was really the team in the background that was doing the work to solidify the infrastructure to be able to go and deliver on that. And I'm oversimplifying this point. There were plenty of other things we needed to fix as well, but that was, the centerpiece of some of our efforts.
I mean, regardless of whatever metric you use, NPS, CSAT, net dollar retention, I guess would be how it comes out in the wash. To play it back, it sounds like education and alignment are what actually move the needle.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Let's talk about education and alignment here in a minute, but maybe one more note on NPS and bring it back to our earlier comment about churn being a lagging indicator. I mean, this is a
Yeah.
case in point example where our churn didn't look that bad at the onset of this, right? But you get NPS, it's like -26. Are people just going to like stay on this solution? When things got really bad, we had a year where our gross churn was 40%, if you could believe it, right?
Wow,
Now,
that's hard to battle.
it's very hard to battle. The thing I'll highlight alongside that, though, is the net retention looked bad, but not awful. And I would be remiss as we talk about this. It's really important for any business that those numbers are always looked at as paired metrics. And I worry a lot about this, particularly in the era of all of this explosive AI growth right now, right? Where if you have a segment of customers that have explosive growth and they're expanding, it's relatively straightforward to juice that net retention number, but it can really be mirroring or masking, excuse me, a real problem in the gross retention number. So I always just like to make that PSA when you look at those things side by side, because to the naked eye, if you came into Sailthru and you only looked at net retention, you could say something like, oh, maybe there's like a little bit of a churn problem, but they're upselling well. And if you only looked at that, it would have masked a big problem. But, that's a segue point into what you said. So much of this is just kind of, educating people on what matters. And so let's talk about, the turnaround strategy, for lack of a better term, that we embarked in after this. And I will tell you, like, the moral of the story and the end of the story is like, over the next couple of years, we drove over a 55-point increase in that NPS score, right? But it was work and it took years to do. But one of the things we did was we said, okay, going back to the concept of first team, nothing else matters in the business if the business isn't hitting the numbers that matter to us. And so we talked about our goals in 3 broad buckets for literally years. And the 3 broad buckets were, 1, we have to grow the business, state the obvious. Number 2 is we have to be a trusted partner again, right? Because we're losing on reputation. And 3, and this will be music to your ears as a CFO, was we have to operate this business predictably and responsibly. Because at this point, we hadn't raised more capital. This all kind of happened, right after our Series C fundraise. And so every all hands, every month for 5+ years had the same opening slides, those 3 big buckets. And there were consistent metrics in each one. So for grow the business, it was exit ARR. And we liked exit ARR because it brought in the new logo growth, but it also accounted for the install base, right? Protection of churn, and then obviously, hopefully monetizing with cross-sell and upsell. In the be a trusted partner, we use the NPS metric. Now, you can, again, argue the merits of that metric all day long, but ours was in the toilet. So we had to draw company emphasis to it month in and month out and talk about it. And then the third bucket for a while for us was a kind of a net burn target. Once the business became cash flow positive, we switched it to more of an EBITDA target for the business as we became more Rule 40 focused. But everyone in the company knew those were the 3 big buckets that we cared about. And then if we didn't deliver on those, nothing else mattered. So education was number 1. And again, it was repetition. Every single month, we talk about the same things. Everybody's fluent on them. But the number 1 thing I always say when it comes to, aligning teams is that your team will never be fully aligned if the compensation plan is not. Exactly. I mean, we all know the Charlie Munger line, right? Like, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome.
For the outcome. Yeah.
And so the most powerful thing we ever did on that journey was we revamped the executive bonus plan. And we said every executive, whether you're the head of sales or you're the CTO, whatever, is going to have the exact same plan, right? It's, 30% of base comp, a little bit of nuance for the CRO on commission stuff, but like 30% of base comp. And there are 3 metrics that go into that. It's the exit ARR, it's the NPS, and then it's whatever the financial target of the hour was. You have not seen behavioral change in a product leader until you see what happens, right? When suddenly that metric is in the mix of things, right? Suddenly we're having conversations like, well, 70% of the sprint team resources should be dedicated toward the existing customer needs, right? And satisfying that. And I'm picking on executive team, but I think that cascades the whole way down. Or if you have a gross churn problem, you can't have account managers who are just comped on bookings. You know what I mean? Like, you need their help in the trenches of trying to prevent the bleeding.
But like a CTO, they want to work on the sexy stuff. They want to build new products. Is there a discussion to be had where you're like, listen, we got to work on maintaining our customer base and stopping the bleed here? Like, you got to make things right with like this code base before we start talking about new products?
100%. And I talked about the, comp plan alignment, but another way to go about that is you have everyone on the executive team involved in things like executive sponsorship, right? So there's nothing worse than having to go out and like, you're the front line. Forget the CSM, or CS leader. We actually had our CFO in the executive sponsorship program where he had a couple of accounts that were assigned to him, and he had to go be the complaint department. It was very powerful. It's very, very powerful. It also put aside anything around the turnaround, having the CFO involved. And I think Marty Meyer, who was the CFO of our business at this time, is amazing. I think he had 2 or 3 accounts. It also helped him build this amazing empathy with the commercial and customer teams when he was like on the receiving end, you know what I mean, of how they were, talking about contracts and renewals and things like that too. So there's lots of other, plays from the playbook, but we absolutely talked about that. But listen, at the end of the day, particularly in venture-backed startups, we're all playing for equity, right? Particularly, at the executive level. And it kind of comes back to that earlier point. Like, you cannot build enterprise value without customer value. And it's insane to me how often people forget that. And so when you put incentives aside, I'm like, if you want a really easy way to align the first team, align them around the customer. That's what matters.
Okay, so we've talked about keeping customers around. I'm going to zig a little bit here. Have you ever had to fire a customer, Cassie?
Yes. And this is a fun one. So I'm going to stick with another example from Sailthru because I think it's a good one. I mentioned that, our product was harder to use. And that was by design, right? We were doing a lot of, personalization, data tagging stuff before AI, right? When AI was what we called algorithm involved was the definition of AI at that time. And so, we kind of went through the thing that every company goes through where it's like, well, that customer thinks they're a special snowflake, right? And they need all of the support. So we said, okay, let's go run the numbers, right? And let's look at what's happening across the customer base. And I can remember this one very powerful analysis we did where we said, let's look at our customer count by ACV band, right? So the segment of customers that are paying us north of $500K per year, the segment of customers that are sub $100K, right? We had kind of all the different slices and dices. And then we said, within each one of those, let's look at the total percent of ARR that band represents. And now let's look at the total percent of CSM hours spent. And this is important because this wasn't a customer level profitability assessment, which we've also done. We said, let's look at CSM specifically. So we had the CSMs tracking their time, which they, of course, love, note sarcasm. And we said, now let's look at the results and then let's look at NPS for each one of those segments. What was wild, and I don't remember like the exact numbers, but the numbers I'm going to give you are directionally accurate here, is that the sub 100K contract value segment, right, was something like 13% of the total ARR of the business, but what's consuming almost 40% of the CSM team's time, which is insane, right? When you think about that. Versus if you go to the 500K plus segment, it was literally the inverse of that. And so we went and talked. First of all, I talked to the board before we did any of this, right? Because I'm like, I could get fired, right? As we go and talk to this segment, like they amount to a reasonable, amount of churn. And we said, okay, what can we do about this? And we said, well, let's give the customer some optionality here. If they're going to consume all these resources, they could stay, but they need to pay for those resources. So we launched basically a services package that we masked as ARR, right? Where we said you can pay $12K a year and you can continue to have access for CSM, right? Number one. Number two is you don't get to call them anymore. You can call like basic support, right? But we're not going to help you in this high intervention way. Or number three is you can say, Sailthru, go screw yourself, but we'll let you go month to month on your contract. We'll be super flexible with that. And the way we went about it is we did it tranche because I was very afraid that every single one of those customers was going to be in bucket 3 and tell us to go take a hike. And what was wild is that, we did lose some customers. The vast majority of them ended up opting into this $12K a year thing. It was $1,000 a month for them. Do you know what I mean? To be able to go and have access to this. We only did it for the sub 100K segment that was there. So that was sort of the story and sort of going to fire. But I think the bigger thing, it actually comes back to this thing on competing on reputation. You do not want customers that are like not in the right ideal customer profile box for your, on your product and on your solution. And so, I sit on a lot of boards now. One of my favorite slides to see is in the post-Series B company, like the net retention chart that shows current ICB customers versus legacy. And we're kind of talking about how we're moving the legacy ones out and we understand the health, do you know what I mean, of what the new ones look like. Because in any business, that ideal segment can and absolutely should evolve.
And I'm sure you also work with earlier seed
We
stage
do.
companies
Yeah.
where their roadmap ends up being dictated by just the customer who's the loudest, not necessarily the customer who has the best thing in mind for everybody else.
That's right. And absolutely. And that's our core business. At the end of the day, we're a firm that's purpose built for the seed to series A journey, right? So our first check's in that seed. So we see that a lot. And everyone's kind of figuring it out for the first time, right? And I think it's the founders that really are out in market and listening to the market and their would-be buyers, not just the squeaky
Yeah.
one or two big early customers who always win in the long game.
The word incentives has come up a couple of
Yeah.
times. What do you think is more powerful in a modern day SaaS company, the carrot or the stick?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's maybe first ground people and what we mean when we talk about comp with the carrot or the stick. So let's use sellers because this is an easy one to do it, right? So the carrot here would be, you have a baseline commission rate of 8%. And the carrot is, you sign a multi-year deal and now that's 9%, right? You get paid annually up front, right? And you get the bump on it. The stick is the inverse where it's like, we're going to assume you do all of these things and you don't do them. We're going to start taking away from your comp. Right. In general, I prefer the carrot for people. I think that's, human psychology. So my approach is always start with the carrot, but utilize the stick when required. So I'm going to give you actually a relevant example to something we just talked about with firing customers. I mentioned that we needed CSMs to track their time. And we needed that for a lot of reasons that ultimately behooved them. Right. And our CSMs had a quarterly bonus that they, ultimately earned. We tried lots of nice ways to kind of get them to track their time, et cetera. And there were just a lot of people who weren't doing it. And I said, you know what? It's pretty easy. If you miss it 3 weeks in a quarter, you just don't get your bonus, right? And that's
Oh,
the stick, right? Because this wasn't even a heavy lift. And, guess what happened? People track their time, right? They put it in when we went to go do that. So all kidding aside, I do much prefer the carrot for people. I like giving them something to work toward and being aspirational that way. But I do sometimes think there's a time and a place for the stick when you may ultimately need it. But I always say start with the carrot and, the stick is the break glass plan, right? When that's not working for you for some reason.
I might be a bleeding heart, but I've always been more of a carrot CFO because I never want someone to feel like they overachieved and I come in at the very end and be like 10% off.
I completely agree. And particularly, the sellers, I think it's so important. You want them, you want sellers to make a ton of money, right? You want them to be thinking bigger and bigger about, where that ultimately goes.
And I mean, it's the same math. I'd rather them achieve 90% and they feel really good about it. And they're like, next quarter, I can still hit 100. I'm in the ballpark versus doing this kabuki discounting thing at the end because you didn't do these activities.
Yeah, this is a little bit outside of the realm of carrot specifically, but I'll tell you one of the best comp decisions I ever made was with our CSM team where I mentioned before they had this quarterly bonus. And it's like most bonus plans. It was tied to net retention. There was a floor on it, and then there were accelerators if they overachieved. If they miss the floor, that sucks, right? You don't get your bonus for a quarter. But I instituted this thing, which was the year-end catch-up, which is if you miss it for the quarter, but you hit on the year, you could actually get back some of that lost bonus. And it was because people think about it, if you have a terrible quarter, how am I going to keep you engaged?
Your head's out of the game. That's not doing me any service.
Yeah.
How do you feel about, I'm completely taking this a little off the rails.
I told you, I was like, let's just go brief for it. Yeah.
I love it. So CSMs, I've had a lot of them on MBO plans that feel a little fishy.
Yeah.
Should they be on hard number plans?
Yeah, I hate MBO plans. There's a time and a place for an MBO plan, and it's an employee's first 90 days. That's the only time I think it's remotely acceptable, right? Where, they literally, there's nothing they could do to derive a number. Yes, I think that CSMs absolutely, need to be on quantitative plans because even if you have an account management team that sits up, alongside them, that's driving the upsell, driving the renewal, it's their work that they're quarterbacking week in and week out that is ultimately the input into driving that output. So for CSMs in particular, I do think net retention tends to be a great metric because it's the catch-all of everything that goes into it. But one thing I always like to do was use that for 2/3 or 70% of the plan and then think about one thing that really mattered for the business at that time and supplementing the balance of the plan with that. So let's say that you're an earlier stage business and you only have one SKU that you're selling, right? You're doing that. You're basically trying to drive, volume-based growth to drive, organic expansion. But now you have a new product for the first time. I would say in that instance, I would take the other third of the bonus and really try to drive behavior in that particular quarter to get multiple people upsold or cross-sold onto that product. Now, you could say you're double dipping because that number shows up in the adoption and it also shows up on the net retention, but I actually don't care about double dipping if it's driving to a behavior that really matters, right? I'm talking to a CFO, so that may be dangerous, but I like it as a baseline, and there can be something that's less financial metric oriented and more adoption oriented that can supplement it when the business has a need.
To the point of P&L fluency, something that you can do if there is a quota-ish element to a CSM's plan is you can classify them in the sales group, which is out of your gross margin.
That's
But
right.
if it's an MBO, like I feel obligated to have to put them up in the cost of sales.
That's right. That's right. And actually, like now I'm totally going off course. Like that
Yeah.
example, right, of where people are classified is a hugely important one. And this is a place where I think, unfortunately, I've seen a lot of customer success leaders be very, very weak on the financials. There's one function, if I had to pick on it, that I wish were quite a bit stronger. And you just hinted at a great example where if you're owning CSMs and you're owning support, you have to understand the key work streams of what those people are ultimately doing. And how many times have I seen the organization where early on they're just hiring CSMs to do everything, right? Which includes technical support. You get it. Those CSMs cost 30% more than a support agent who can do it. So like you're jacking up your cost of revenue just because like you don't want to specialize the role. So that's totally off kilter. But you just talked about that example. I'm like, yes, there's myriad reasons why people have to understand, how this work is classified and where it goes.
Well, there's also like the game inside the game. Like if you make the right business case, I want to give you more resources.
100%. Yeah.
I can't just crush my gross margin though by, like you said, our product has weaknesses. So we have to shove a bunch of Band-Aids to have a human go at it.
That's right. That's right.
All right. You've got to tell the ladder story. Cash-based milestones, black tie parties every few weeks. What was going on there?
Okay. So let me walk this back here. So the ladders.com was the first tech job I ever had. So I started my career on Wall Street, left in 2006 to join. I was a 36th employee of a startup. Everyone in my family thought I was completely crazy. And this was a different era, right? We had raised like $7.25 million Series A. We never raised another, dime of venture capital again. And so we were growing on the back of good old-fashioned direct response marketing. So now everyone's calling it like performance marketing and growth hacking. But I'm like, listen, this existed since like the LL Bean catalog, came to be, right? Just this concept of direct marketing. But we were growing, and we were growing really, really rapidly with that tactic. And so our incentive that we gave the company was we want to really celebrate growth, but cash is king, people, right? So we want to get everyone thinking about how we bring cash in the door. This was a subscription business for job seekers. So job seekers paid us a monthly subscription to access jobs that paid a higher salary. And so when I got there in 2006, this program was already in place where every time the business hit a milestone, where in a single week, it generated another 100K in cash. So the first time we hit 100K in cash in a week, 200K in cash in a week, 300K in cash in a week, there would be a crazy monster blowout black tie party. Like you got to bring a guest, and these were at like legit places in New York. So we would do this, and it was like, everyone was like, we got to get to like, what are we going to do for the 500K? Like everyone's very, charged up about it. But then, good news, bad news, the business really started finding its footing and finding predictable growth and all of these things. And so it'd be like, well, it was the 400K party, and now it's the 500K party. And
Every week.
But it became a little bit crazy. And so, the party planning committee, for the office fans out there, right, that was, thinking about this was like, guys, enough. And so I can remember, and I was early in my career at this point, the day that we hit 600K, we had like a toast in the office, and everybody came back to their desk, and there was an envelope on it, and everyone just got $600 cold hard cash, right? And we had always 22, 23-year-olds who were like, this is a basic, this is, like, I didn't think I was going to hit my rent this month, right? And now I can go and do it. But it was a wild story. And we did this all the way up to the first time that we made $1 million in cash in a single week, which I think was like shortly before the holiday season. And so we did a rent out of the New York Public Library. We had like crazy blowout black tie party. I think we had our board there. And that was the end of the black tie parties on the other side of it. But I always tell that story because I'm like, it actually got people really grounded in cash. Like I remember our customer support associates, they'd be on the phone with these people, and they actually understood working capital of like the monthly versus the annual plan, right? Because we would talk about this, and it comes back to the education piece of, we would talk openly with them around the the merit, right, of collecting that cash up front, never mind the black tie party that came on the other side of it.
Well, as a CFO, one of my first jobs is to explain to people how money enters and leaves the building. And I
Yeah.
feel like I wish I had that example because it just makes it so tangibly real for people.
Totally. Yeah, for sure. So that's like one of my favorite ones. And, for what it's worth, I look back on that. It was like, as I said, first experience in tech. I was there for 3 years. The company grew from 36 people to over 400 and then contracted massively it turns out job search is not a good category to be in during the global financial crisis. I look back on that experience so fondly because Mark Sanadella, the founder and CEO of that company, really led by such example in terms of the transparency that he brought to the company around the metrics that mattered. And so for me, as my first operating job, it set a bar for what to expect that I ended up carrying with me the rest of my career.
Thank you for sharing that. That's so
Yeah.
cool. Man, I still don't know how to tie a bow tie though. All right, I want to take your experience and now apply it to today. So you're working with these early stage companies at Primary. A lot of them are trying to figure out their first incentive comp plans, trying to figure out which go-to-market execs to hire. And they're selling an AI product that has like blow the doors off growth, but also some weird retention
Yeah.
stuff. Like how are you coaching them on how to form a team and give them the right incentives with this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, listen, I think I always say the first team you build is even very different than the early team you built, right?
There's a
Meaning, like,
difference?
the difference is, if you think about that very first seller that you bring into the business, that's going to be fundamentally a completely different hire than the third seller that you bring into the business because that first seller, there is no infrastructure for them, right? They have to be excited about solving a 0 to 1 problem,
Yeah.
building their own tooling. And I think I'm picking on sales, but that applies to any which function in the business. And so
Here's a phone and a machete. Good luck.
Totally. And I do think, a lot of founders, particularly technical founders who spent less time in a go-to-market organization will say, well, I need to hire, a VP of sales. I'm like, for the love of God, do not hire a VP of sales. Like, you will hate them. They will hate you. Like, we will be back on the phone, like negotiating their, exit package here, within 180 days if I'm a betting woman. And so I think it's like, finding those people who are sort of the scrappy and dangerous generalists on the business side, right? And supplement it with a great, there's a new title that's emerging in sales of the founding account executive. And
I'm
there's
seeing that on like all sorts of things, like founding accountant, founding marketer. I hadn't heard of this until this year.
it's a great way to like get people in where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to go in, I'm going to take this risk of being the first person, but okay, now I get to like say this, like I'm not a co-founder, but I get to do it. But it's working as a recruiting tool is what I'll
Okay.
tell you. Like we see it in our portfolio. But listen, like the early incentive plans, I think it should come back to first team alignment. And so I think it's really hard to give like AE 1 or 2, like a super robust, thoughtful compensation plan, right? So a lot of times you see this tied, more to like the business success, right? Or the ARR milestones that the company's trying to get to. I love for early stage companies having time-based goals with kickers on them, right? So if you say, okay, we want to get to, 5 million by the end of the year, everybody gets a sweetener if we get to 5 million by the end of October, right? So how do we, try to go and do that? I think it'd be a powerful tactic. But, in general, with the early stage companies right now, the number one thing on my mind is, listen, the vast majority of investments we're making right now are AI native companies. And I think we're still in the very, very early innings of like most of these AI native companies have barely lived through renewal cycles. Right. And so going back to our question of like leading indicators, it really worries me. And, I think Clouded Judgment, I remember very clearly their newsletter was March of 2024. So it was a while ago. He went on record kind of saying, hey, we're living in this conundrum of like, is this ARR or is this ERR? Is it experimental run rate revenue where everyone's just like buying stuff, but who knows what's going to happen? I still worry about this today. I worry about it enough that there was a startup that got in a little bit of trouble, thankfully not in our portfolio, a couple months ago, where there was a TechCrunch expose where, they had been an AI darling, they raised all this money, and then it turned out like all these customers had opt-out clauses and they left. When that article came out, 3 different people at Primary asked me if I tipped off the reporter because all I did was talk about ARR and ERR. But I think it's really important. And I beat this drum with founders all the time. So what's the mitigant on this? If it takes a while, to get to the renewal cycle, I think it again comes down to like the customer lock-in, right? And so time to value is more important than ever before because you talk to these economic buyers, they will tell you they are piloting a dozen plus tools. That go-to-market event I just came back from, I heard a great analogy. Someone called AI for go-to-market buyers the island of misfit toys, which I thought was hilarious, right? But it was this whole idea of you're buying all this stuff, like who knows what's going to happen with it. And so I keep saying, like, right now, I don't care if you're a pre-seed company, I don't care if you're a Series B company, customer success is on the brink of this major, major renaissance because everyone is shiny object syndrome to run to the next thing. And if it's not unequivocal value creation for the customer, like there's no enduring revenue to be had.
That's great. That's great. I think we're definitely living in a world where we're making long-term decisions without going through one renewal cycle. And like comp decisions are like a 1-year thing. Maybe if you're living really fast, like a 6-month thing. But I think a lot of people are planning their roadmaps and also raising off of like 6 months worth of evidence.
Totally. And I think it's like, listen, investors in the follow-on rounds, I think have wised up to it. I have a partner, last year who made this funny comment to me that it felt like Series A's were being done on vibes, is what she said to me, my partner, Emily. And I think like you're starting to see some of that. Listen, things are crazy right now, to be clear, right? The pace of deal making is akin to what we saw in 2021, which is kind of frightening, including even at seed, right? The quantum of capital that we need to put in to win a first check is 20 to 25% higher than where it was a year ago. The speed of these deals is crazy. But I do think that the downstream investors are becoming more disciplined around their customer diligence, knowing this risk, right, of everybody trying a lot of things. So I do think companies have to keep it front and center. But it's funny. I think it's like become like a disease how often I talk about this. And, one of what my portfolio companies here at Primary is a company called One Mind AI native business. The founder of Andy Kalo's amazing, amazing CEO. And I can remember she has this customer that she's done really well with signing expansion deals, et cetera. Every time she signs an expansion deal, she texts me, not ERR, Cassie, not ERR. And I'm like, I'm here for that. I want people to challenge me on it, not the ERR all day long. That's exactly where we want things to go.
Well, gearing towards the close, I did want to bring it back to P&L fluency because
Let's
you
do
got
it.
thousands of CFOs listening. And something that really struck me when we first met and had a conversation
Wow.
was how you explained there's a particular segment of the workforce that's held back just because they don't sometimes have the same opportunities to learn.
Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of give you a platform to talk about like how we can enable others and be advocates for people to understand the P&L and just why that's so important to help people get ahead in their career.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give you like a little bit of a long-winded answer to this, and then I'll give you like a direct headline
for it.
call to action for all of the CFOs out there. So to your point, I have a particular passion on this, for women specifically, partially because there's a majorly because there's a structural issue with them being underrepresented in B2B software companies at senior leadership more generally. So, OpenView used to put together these benchmarks where they looked at the number of women holding senior leadership titles at B2B software companies. I use air quotes because they had to go down to the director level to like really get some interesting data. And the last time that was tracked, even going as far south as a director level, the median 50 million and up ARR software business, it was only 30% of those roles were held by women. There was no data at the VP level or higher because it falls off a cliff, right? I think this is particularly acute in B2B software. And so for me, like I really want to see more women. I love software. I joke my nickname sometimes around here is Sassy Cassie. But and so this is a passion project of mine. And so a few years ago, actually taking it full circle to Sam Jacobs, he asked me to come give a keynote at their first ever CRO summit on how not to get fired as a CRO. And so I love a spicy prompt. So I was like, all right, Sam, challenge accepted. But when I worked on my slides, CJ, I'm like, these have nothing to do with CROs. I just focused on 2 of the 4 things we talked about. I talked about P&L command and first team thinking. And I gave this keynote and the room loved it. Everyone's like super bought into it. I got all this great kudos. But I looked out in the audience and it was 90% men. And so I walked off that stage being like, I just gave a cheat code to a room full of dudes when I'm like passionate about helping women. And so I started a program in 2023 called On the Business. It's like thinking on the business versus in the business for senior women in software. It's C-suite and VP level women. We do them in New York once a quarter. We do them in San Francisco a few times a year. We've done it in London. So this is a call to action. Like, you can follow me on LinkedIn. But what CFOs can do, coming back to it, is the number one hack that I give these women in these sessions is if you want the cheat code for getting to know the P&L, take your CFO out to lunch. Because keep me honest on this, CJ, I don't think CFOs are drowning in social invitations to go to lunch with their colleagues.
We never get invited to drinks after work.
So I tell them, like, it's just go ask them, hey, can you walk me through the nuances of our specific P&L? Where's the board riding you? And honestly, I don't think that's just an executive level thing. I think it cascades its entire way down the organization. Meaning, if you are a middle manager, go ask the manager of FP&A out to lunch, because definitely no
Totally.
one's invited that guy out to lunch, right? And
Yeah.
you can get it. You can match like for like of where you're at with your seniority level to go and do it. And I'm giving like the organizational specific context. In a world of AI, I just made this comment at an event recently. You could go have ChatGPT coach you through a SaaS P&L, right, and kind of ask it questions intelligently. So there's really no excuse now with sort of the open sourcing of information. But I do think there's so much nuances, to each specific business, that there's immense power. And so, that's one thing I would say. And then the only other thing I would offer is, when I was in the operating world, I worked with so many great CFOs who would do these regular sessions where it was like a breakfast learning series where they would take the whole company top to bottom through the P&L. And I think if there's CFOs out there that aren't doing that, it's so valuable and so appreciated, and a great way just to, even if it's not you, if it's someone on the team doing it, just to build like, internal branding and followership for the function.
Our chief of people, she came in as just the VP of HR, Amber Russell at Parts Tech. She quickly became our chief people officer and then also the chief of staff. And her rise was so fast because she understood resource allocation.
Yeah.
She understood that 70% of the dollars that we spent were people.
Yeah.
And so she would always think about what's the function that we have to fill before the person that we want to place there. And like you could call it, she understood the SaaS metrics, she understood the P&L, but at the end of the day, she understood how to allocate resources.
I love that example. And, I regularly tell people, I had the CRO job. I am not the best head of sales you should hire. I'm not the best head of CS, account management, list all the functions. I'm not the best person for that job. But the reason I was able to grow and excel in my career is because I'm a really strong general manager. And I think that comes back to the central concept of P&L command, right? And so I only survived because I had incredible VPs who were way smarter than me and their domain areas beneath me. But I could teach them, what that meant in terms of growing and advancing the business.
Love it. Cassie, this has been a blast. I had even more questions, so.
Oh, so fun. I feel like we could talk for hours. Yeah.
We're going to have to do a part 2 at some point.
I love it. I would welcome that. Thank you again for having me.
Run the Numbers is a mostly media production. Yelling and intro by Fat Joe. Artwork by Meg D'Alessandro. Show is executive produced by Ben Hillman. Nothing said on this podcast is intended to be business or investment advice. It's the sole opinion of me, a guy who feeds his dog way too much ice cream and has a history of net operating losses. LOL. If you like this podcast, hit subscribe and give us 5 stars. It will take like 2 seconds and our algorithm overlords love it. Drink water, call your mom, and have a great day. Peace.